it's really interesting seeing people try and pretend the Switch can't compete, that the Switch isn't going to be able to beat out the PS5 and the Series X, that Nintendo's on the way out, that they have to release a new console, when you can look at the sales charts and see that the Switch is selling like, I don't know, like 16 million units a year, like on a bad year, right? Like it's declined since 2020 to be sure, but what you have to understand is that 2020 was the all-time high for the Nintendo Switch, right? When you actually look at the numbers, when you actually look at like how much the software is selling, when you look at like the units that are still being moved, when you look at how people are still using the units they already have, you have this very clear, distinguishable reality that Nintendo is stopping the competition right now. And of course, nobody wants to admit it, because the narrative has always been that Nintendo can't compete with other consoles. Xbox, PlayStation, Valve, like the Nokia N-Gage, like Atari, the Sega Dreamcast, like the Neo Geo, like the MSX, like the TurboGrafx 16, like all of these people are just like, oh yeah, Nintendo's on the way out. They can't compete. They're done. Like nobody cares about Mario anymore. And of course, it's never ever been true. And like honestly, to me, it feels more and more as if it's never been less true when it comes to the Switch, because we're in an era where the majority, where all these Nintendo games, ones that were traditionally written off, stuff like Pikmin, stuff like Fire Emblem, stuff like that. Like those games are doing really, really well. While games like Super Mario Bros. Wonder launch out of the gate with huge numbers, in spite of like the industry's very, very dedicated slander campaign to try and downplay it. Like anybody who's been following this channel knows what happened with Mario Wonder, right? Where the game gets announced, everybody threw up their hands. Oh, this is the last Switch game ever, right? And then like we were approaching a release, and then people were trying to tell us that like, oh, this isn't a major release for 2023. Nobody cares about it. It's a 2D platformer, blah blah blah. And then it comes out, and then it sells like 11 million units, right? Which is phenomenal for a 2D platformer, right? Like Mario Wonder was my game of the year, right? You're really gonna tell me that like my game of the year doesn't mean anything and that it's not impactful and that people aren't excited about it? No. And I am tired of this happening every single time with every single Nintendo game. And I think every single Nintendo console, right? Switch is well on its way to being the best-selling console ever in the next year or so. Right? I've been saying this since the beginning. Like the Switch is poised to become the best-selling video game platform of all time. And yet, are you seeing people acknowledging that? Are you seeing them celebrating it? Are you seeing them pointing out the obvious that, like, oh man, all these Nintendo games are really popular? That's going to strengthen their brand, and that's going to segue into sales of their older titles, and people will more eagerly anticipate the new ones. No! Like, you're seeing people cope. You're seeing people seethe. You're seeing people try to convince themselves that, like, people only buy Mario because of brand recognition. It's not because they actually like the games. Like, you see people like try to gaslight you. Oh, the old games were better, even though they don't play the old games or the new games, right? You see people like create conspiracies about Pokemon, about Zelda, about like all this stuff. Like you see people awarding Game of the Year awards to Baldur's Gate 3 to try and like diminish Zelda's momentum. Not gonna happen, right? That hasn't happened, right? But the industry desperately wants you to think it has, right? That the entire generation has been building up to this, where like the Switch would be replaced by the PlayStation and Xbox consoles, the real gaming platforms with the real games. And um, the reality is, like, what games on PS5 and Xbox Series X have come out, right? Like basically nothing. Like there have been no major releases. Anybody who tries to point to like Ratchet and Clank or uh like Final Fantasy 16 or Diablo 4 or like anything that's come out in recent years as like major PlayStation exclusives is straight up delusional. Nothing that has come out recently has been relevant, right? When the big de facto game you have to lean on to like prove your relevancy is Elden Ring, you know you have a problem because because Tears of the Kingdom sold just as well at it in like a fraction of the time, right? Like it wasn't even close, and that was a sequel, right? So the reality is, like the fact of the matter is, people are becoming more and more reliant on these established video game IPs. They're becoming more and more reliant on licensed games. They're becoming more and more reliant on the hardware to protect them from the reality that Nintendo is doing better than they are, right? We're seeing the entire gaming industry like collapse all around us. They're putting out stuff like Suicide Squad and Overwatch 2, Final Fantasy 16, Forspoken. And we're supposed to grin and say that like, oh man, just wait until Grand Theft Auto 6 comes out. Then Nintendo will be sorry. Hey, genius. Grand Theft Auto 6 is one game. Like it won't even be like that impactful for like a full year, probably. Everyone's gonna play it, everyone's gonna buy it, right? Like everyone's going to like, have Grand Theft Auto 6, and then they're going to move on to other games. And the issue with that is that all of the other games are on Nintendo platforms, right? Like I've been saying for a long time that Grand Theft Auto is like the last pillar of PlayStation and Xbox because I do think that's the only reason that people are holding out hope for this console generation is that like, oh, Grand Theft Auto 6 will save us. It'll be amazing. Like Rockstar will never go woke, even though they actually have a long time ago. They've always been woke, right? Like Grand Theft Auto will save us, right? Like they have to lean more and more on like Call of Duty, on Grand Theft Auto, on the annual sports games, on like live service passes, on DLC, on like these flavor of the month games that nobody cares about, like Hi-Fi Rush and Power Worlds, right? Like that's how bad things are getting for the non-Nintendo community. And meanwhile, you still have people like who genuinely believe that like mobile gaming is going to eclipse Nintendo, that that a PC gaming is going to eclipse Nintendo, and in reality, that hasn't happened yet. It's never going to happen, right? Like they're going to coexist, guys. It's not that hard to wrap your mind around that people will still continue buying Nintendo hardware because of the Nintendo games, right? But people really have it in their heads that like, oh, everyone's just going to emulate that, even though that's illegal and it's getting cracked down on all the time, right? It's straight up delusional, right? Like this gen has been really really interesting because it really demonstrates like Switch has been on the top of the sales charts all generation long, right? It outdid the PS4 and the Xbox One, and it's handedly outcompeting the Xbox Series X and the PS5. You know, and yet you don't see people really acknowledging it. You can look at the Famitsu charts if you don't believe me. Like, this year was the first time that like more than like two PS5 games like topped the charts, and Switch still outsold the PS5, right? Like even in this like once in a blue moon week where a bunch of games came out at once, stuff like Tekken 8, which is huge. These games came out, like they didn't drive PS5 sales, right? People weren't buying them. People weren't like excited about Tekken 8. Like, I was excited for Tekken 8, and you know what I ended up doing in the end? Like, oh, I would rather play it on Switch, and I ended up not buying it. I told them on Twitter, like, yeah, put it on a Nintendo console, or I'm not playing it, right? And I have to wonder if more people are going along with me, right? I know it's kind of a thing in the community to think that people are going to PC, but like rather than playing on console, but like you know that's still not a sale for PlayStation and Xbox, right? People are moving away from those platforms because they've demonstrated that they're toxic. They've demonstrated that they can't produce good games. They've demonstrated that they can't produce hardware. They have demonstrated that they cannot compete in this gaming industry. And yet, still, even at this late stage, where the gaming industry is collapsing among us, right? We are in the middle of the second American gaming crash right now. Uh, it's still not talked about. People are doing everything they possibly can to keep the narrative going because they know, like, once the narrative implodes, once the consoles leave the industry, once Nintendo has their monopoly over the console gaming space, like, there is going to be no coming back for this, right? There is going to be no recovery, right? Like, Nintendo will have a monopoly over that sphere, and they will continue thriving in it, right? They will have their competitors, of course, with like the new streaming services and play and PC and mobile, but they're all like very distinct from each other, right? The reality is that Nintendo straight up won the console war, right? They did a long time ago, but like nobody really wants to acknowledge that as the case, right? Everybody is fighting to the death to try and deny the reality that Nintendo has beaten Sony and Microsoft in spite of all the overwhelming odds against them.